My mother called me on a Tuesday morning at 7:43, which was unusual because my mother never calls before 9. The first thing she said was, "Your father has been seeing someone." Not the typical way to start a conversation, but then again, nothing about my family ever followed the typical script. I was sitting in my apartment in the city, 3 hours away from the town I grew up in, and I remember the coffee going cold in my hands while she explained the situation. He had met this woman at his office, a younger woman, someone named Catherine, and apparently they had been together for almost 2 years. 2 years. My parents had been married for 31 years at that point, and my mother found out about the affair the way people find out about most devastating things now, through a credit card statement, through a hotel charge that didn't match any vacation she remembered taking. My first instinct was anger. My second instinct was to drive home and say the things I knew would shatter whatever remained of the family we had built. But I didn't do either of those things. Instead, I hung up the phone, finished my coffee, and went to work, because I had learned a long time ago that impulse and catastrophe are often the same thing, and that the people who survive family disasters are not the ones who react first, they are the ones who think first. 3 weeks later, I was sitting across from my father in a diner near his office, the kind of place with vinyl booths and laminated menus, and a waitress named Carol who had been working there since before I was born. He looked smaller than I remembered, which is a thing people say about parents when they are ashamed of them. I think. He looked at his hands more than he looked at me. He said, "I know your mother told you." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I don't expect you to understand." And I said, "You're right, I don't." And then we sat in silence for a while, because there really wasn't anything else to say. But here is what I didn't know then, and what I wouldn't understand for another 3 years, and what I want to tell you now, because it might save you from making the same mistake I almost made. My father wasn't staying in that marriage because he loved my mother. He wasn't staying in it because of me, or my sister, or the house we grew up in, or any of the reasons people usually use to justify staying in situations that have stopped working. He was staying in it because he was terrified, not of my mother, and not of the consequences, but of himself. He was terrified of what kind of person he would become if he actually admitted what he wanted, if he actually chose himself instead of choosing the comfortable, familiar shape of a life that fit him like a suit 2 sizes too small. He was terrified that if he walked away, he would discover that he was exactly the kind of man who could do that, and he didn't want to be that man. So instead, he became the kind of man who cheated, because that was somehow easier than being the kind of man who left. And I think that right there is the story of most people's lives, not the dramatic moment when everything falls apart. That's easy, in a strange way. That's the climax. The real story is what happens in the quiet spaces before that, when you make the small choices that seem insignificant at the time. The choice to stay quiet instead of speaking up, the choice to ignore something instead of confronting it, the choice to keep doing what you've always done instead of trying something different. Those are the choices that reshape your life. Those are the choices that make you into someone you don't recognize. My father made those choices for 31 years. He made them every morning when he woke up next to a woman he no longer loved. He made them every evening when he came home and pretended to be someone he wasn't. He made them every single day until one day he realized he had spent so much time being someone else that he didn't remember who he actually was. So he started seeing Catherine, not because he loved her, I learned later, but because she was the only person in his life who knew who he actually was. She didn't know the version of my father that my mother had constructed over 3 decades. She knew the real version, the one who was tired and afraid and trapped, and that felt like freedom. It felt like someone had finally opened a door and let some air into a room that had been sealed shut for too long. But here's the thing about freedom that nobody tells you. It doesn't come free. It costs something. It costs your marriage. It costs your relationships with your children. It costs your reputation in your small town. It costs the version of yourself that you spent 3 decades building. And some people, when they realize what that cost actually is, they try to go back. They try to pretend the door was never opened, that they never saw what was on the other side, that they can somehow fit themselves back into the life they were living before. My father tried that. He ended things with Catherine. He promised my mother that he would go to therapy, that he would fix whatever was broken inside him, that he would become the man she married. And my mother, because she loved him in the way that people love things they've spent their entire lives building, she believed him. I didn't. I saw what I had seen. I knew what I knew, and I made a choice. I pulled away. I stopped calling. I stopped visiting. I created distance because I couldn't stand to watch him pretend to be someone he wasn't. Couldn't stand to watch my mother pretend to believe the same pretense. Couldn't stand to be part of a family that was held together by lies we all agreed not to speak out loud. For 5 years, that's how it was. Holidays where I sent cards instead of coming home. Birthdays where I called instead of visiting. Conversations that happened at arm's length, through a phone, through a screen, with just enough connection to maintain the family structure, but not enough connection to actually be present in anyone's life. My sister thought I was being cruel. My mother thought I was being judgmental. My father said nothing. He just accepted the distance with the same quiet resignation he accepted everything else, as though my withdrawal was simply another consequence he deserved, another thing he had broken in service to his own comfort. And then, one Tuesday morning, 5 years later, my father had a heart attack. A massive one, the kind the doctors said he probably didn't survive. He was at his office when it happened, alone at his desk, and Carol, the waitress from the diner, happened to be walking past the building and saw him through the window, slumped in his chair. She called the ambulance. She rode with him to the hospital. She was there when he coded, when the doctors did the things doctors do when someone's heart decides it doesn't want to work anymore. He lived. Barely. The doctors said he would need surgery, a bypass, months of recovery, physical therapy, and a complete restructuring of how he lived his life. My mother called me that night. Her voice was different on the phone. It was smaller, older, like the last 5 years had finally caught up with her all at once. She said, "I don't know if he's going to make it." And I said, "He'll make it." Because I believed that he would. Because the alternative was unthinkable. Because I was finally understanding something I should have understood a long time ago. That my father's infidelity was not the worst thing that could happen in our family. The worst thing would be to lose him entirely. The worst thing would be to spend the rest of my life knowing that I had the chance to forgive him, and I didn't. The worst thing would be to realize, too late, that I had made a choice based on righteousness instead of love. I drove home the next morning. It took 3 hours. The whole way, I kept thinking about the diner, about Carol, about how a stranger had saved my father's life while his children and his wife were all somewhere else, living our own lives, making our own choices, not knowing that he was dying. I kept thinking about how fragile everything is, how quickly the solid things can come apart, how much time we waste being angry at people for being human. When I got to the hospital, he was still in recovery. I wasn't allowed in the operating room, so I sat in the waiting area with my mother and my sister, and we didn't talk about the infidelity or the distance or anything else that had been left unsaid for 5 years. We just sat there together in the way families do when they are trying to hold on to something that might slip away. When he was stable enough for visitors, I went into his room. He was smaller than I remembered. The machines made beeping sounds. The monitors showed his heart doing its work. The same heart that had failed him, that had literally almost killed him. Now being kept alive by surgery and medication and the careful work of people who knew how to fix the mechanical parts of a person, even when they couldn't fix the spiritual ones. I stood at the foot of his bed for a long time before he even knew I was there. And when he opened his eyes and saw me, the first thing he did was cry. He cried like a person who had been given a second chance and understood exactly how rare and fragile that was. He cried like someone who had spent 5 years being shut out of his daughter's life and suddenly realized how much those 5 years had cost him. He cried like my father, and I had not seen him cry since I was a child. I moved to the chair beside his bed and took his hand, and we didn't say anything about the past or about Catherine or about any of it. We just sat there, and I let him know that I was there, that I wasn't going anywhere, that whatever had broken between us could maybe be fixed. The recovery was long, 3 months in the hospital and rehabilitation centers, another 6 months of physical therapy, a full year before the doctors said his heart was strong enough that he might actually live a normal life. During that time, I helped. I drove home every other weekend. I sat with him during his appointments. I learned about heart disease and medication interactions and the specific ways that trauma and stress damage the human body in ways that are sometimes reversible and sometimes not. I learned that my father, during all those years when he was pretending to be someone he wasn't, had been under such constant stress that his heart literally could not take it anymore. The doctors called it stress cardiomyopathy. His heart had been failing slowly for years without anyone knowing it. It was the physical manifestation of a life lived in contradiction. My father was lucky. He had the surgery that could save him. He had the recovery time that he needed. He had a second chance at a life that was actually his, instead of one that he was just performing. Not everyone gets that. Not everyone has a daughter who comes back. Not everyone has a heart strong enough to recover. Not everyone survives the choices they make. But my father did. And when he was finally well enough to have real conversations again, we had some hard ones. He told me things about his marriage that I don't think he had ever told anyone. He told me that he had never stopped loving my mother, but that loving her and being with her had become two different things. That you could spend your entire life with someone and still be completely alone. That the distance between two people who are sleeping in the same bed can be wider than the distance between two people who are thousands of miles apart. He told me that meeting Catherine had shown him what it felt like to be known, truly known, in a way he had never experienced before, and that feeling had been so strong that it terrified him. He told me that he had tried to kill that feeling by leaving Catherine because he thought that was what responsibility looked like, that he thought staying in the marriage was the right thing to do, that he thought he could just go back to the life he had been living and pretend that nothing had changed. But nothing in him had changed, except for the fact that he now knew what it felt like to be himself. And you can't unknow that. You can't go back to pretending that the pretense is fine. He told me that every choice he made after meeting Catherine was a choice to lie, either to my mother or to himself, and that lying had made him sick in a way that medicine couldn't touch. And then he said something I've never forgotten. He said, "I'm sorry I wasn't a better example. I'm sorry I showed you that this is what men do, that we lie and cheat and call it protection, that we destroy ourselves trying to be what we think we're supposed to be instead of just being who we actually are." I didn't forgive him then. I'm not sure I have fully forgiven him even now, but I understood him. And understanding, I learned, is sometimes more valuable than forgiveness. It's the thing that comes before forgiveness, the thing that makes forgiveness possible. My father lived another 7 years after his heart attack. 7 years of actual recovery, actual conversation, actual relationship with his children. My mother eventually left him, not because of Catherine, but because after his heart attack, she realized that she had spent 31 years loving someone who didn't exist, and she deserved better. They separated quietly, no drama, no court battles. Just two people who had finally admitted that the thing they had been holding together was only held together by their agreement to not look at it too closely. My father and Catherine got back together. He never married her. He just lived with her. And from what I could tell, he was happy in a way I had never seen him be happy before, because he was finally just being who he actually was. It's strange, I think, how we judge the people we love so harshly for being exactly what they always were. My father didn't change. He was always someone who was capable of cheating, capable of lying, capable of choosing himself over the things he was supposed to choose. I just didn't know about it until the affair. And that knowledge, when it came, felt like betrayal. But now I understand that he was always being betrayed too. He was being betrayed by his own life, by the choices he had made before I was even born, by the systems that taught him that sacrificing himself was the same as loving other people. So here's what I want to tell you. If you are sitting there right now feeling betrayed by someone you love, feeling angry at someone for being exactly who they actually are, instead of who you thought they were or wanted them to be, that person did not betray you by being themselves. They betrayed you by pretending not to be themselves for as long as they could manage it, and then breaking that pretense. And the reason it feels like betrayal is because you built something real in your mind based on something false that they were showing you. You built your relationship on the foundation of their lie, and when the lie cracked, your whole building cracked with it. But here is the thing that took me 5 years to understand, and that I'm telling you now, so maybe you don't have to take 5 years to understand it too. Sometimes people have to break in order to become whole. Sometimes the cracking is the thing that finally opens the way to something real. My father's infidelity broke my family. My father's heart attack broke my father. But that breaking, as painful as it was also the thing that made genuine connection possible. It was the thing that finally allowed me to actually see my father, instead of just seeing the role that my father was playing. It was the thing that allowed him to actually be himself, instead of performing a version of himself. And I think that's what happens to a lot of us. We spend so much time performing the versions of ourselves that we think other people want us to be, that we forget there was always a real version underneath. And when that real version finally cracks through, when it finally can't be contained anymore, everyone acts like it's a betrayal. But it's not a betrayal. It's the moment when the truth finally becomes unavoidable. It's the moment when you have to make a choice. Do you hold on to the false version and pretend it's still real, or do you actually look at what's in front of you and decide what you're going to do about it? My father made the choice to be real. It cost him almost everything. It cost him his marriage, his reputation, his health, the illusion that he was a good man living a good life. But it gave him something too. It gave him the last 7 years of his life with his actual daughter, not the daughter who was staying away to punish him. It gave him time with someone who actually knew who he was. It gave him the chance to live as himself, even if that self was complicated and flawed and human. And I think that's worth something. I think that's worth more than the pretense, even when the pretense felt safe. So that is my story, not the whole story. Nobody ever gets to tell the whole story. But the part that I think matters now, the part that I wish someone had told me when I was younger and angrier and more certain about who was right and who was wrong. People don't betray you by being themselves. They betray you by pretending not to be themselves. And the choice you make when you finally see who they actually are, that is the choice that determines whether you're going to actually have a relationship with a real human being, or whether you're going to keep pretending that the false version is enough. I chose a relationship. It took 5 years of distance and almost losing my father entirely for me to make that choice. But I made it. And in the time I had left with him, in those 7 years after his heart attack, I got to actually know my father in a way I don't think I would have ever known if he hadn't broken, if he hadn't fallen apart, if he hadn't been forced to finally stop pretending. That time was a gift. It was a gift that almost didn't exist, that I almost threw away because I was more committed to my own righteousness than I was to actual human connection. And I think if you are standing at a similar fork right now, if you are deciding whether to pull away from someone you love because of how they've disappointed you, because of how they've revealed themselves to be human instead of perfect, I want you to think about what you might be throwing away. I want you to think about whether being right is actually worth losing the person. I want you to think about whether the version of them that you're angry at is actually worse than the version of them that you never get to know. Because the truth is, most of the people who hurt us aren't bad people who are trying to hurt us. They're scared people who are trying to protect themselves, the same way you're scared and protecting yourself, the same way we're all just doing the best we can with the information we have and the people we are. My father didn't set out to destroy my family. He set out to feel like himself for the first time in 30 years. That's a human thing to do. It's a broken thing to do, but it's human. And I think if we could all be a little less angry at each other for being human, a little more willing to actually see the people we love instead of just the mistakes they made, maybe we'd have a little more time to actually be with them before it's too late. Maybe we wouldn't look back years later and realize that we had the chance to really love them and we chose anger instead. Maybe we would realize that forgiveness isn't about saying that what they did was okay. It's about saying that the person they actually are is worth more to me than the person I wanted them to be. And that is a choice that only you can make. That is a choice that I almost didn't make. And I'm standing here telling you this because I survived it, because I made it to the other side of that anger, because I got those 7 years back with my father, and I don't want you to wake up one day and realize that you didn't. I don't want you to get the call about the heart attack or the car accident or the sudden illness or whatever it is that finally wakes us up to how fragile everything is, and think about all the time you wasted being angry at someone for being exactly the human being they had always been. Because that would be the real tragedy. That would be the real betrayal, the one we do to ourselves.